A thug mocked a respected teacher near Buckingham Palace, confident no one would intervene. But when he raised his fist to strike, the royal guard's discipline broke in an instant. What happened next left the crowd stunned and the thug humiliated. It was a bright, busy day outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered around, excited to see the royal guard standing tall and still at his post. Among the crowd was Mr. Henry Clark, a kind and respected teacher in his 60s. He had spent his life teaching and guiding young minds and was enjoying a quiet moment, admiring the guard's discipline. But the peace didn't last. A loud and rude man shoved through the crowd, yelling and laughing as he mocked the guard. His voice was sharp, and his actions made people uneasy. The royal guard didn't move. He was trained to stay still no matter what. But when the thug turned his attention to Mr. Clark, things were about to change. The royal guard was taught to stand still, but when a thug targeted a respected teacher, everything was put to the test. Mr. Henry Clark stood quietly near the crowd outside Buckingham Palace, watching the royal guard with admiration. His kind eyes reflected years of wisdom, and his soft smile showed his appreciation for the guard's discipline. A retired teacher in his 60s, Mr. Clark had spent his life shaping young minds, teaching children the importance of respect, patience, and kindness. To him, the royal guard symbolized those very lessons: strength in silence, honor in duty, and the ability to stay composed in any situation. But his peaceful moment of admiration was about to be disrupted. The loud, brash thug who had been mocking the guard now shifted his focus. He noticed Mr. Clark standing nearby and saw an easy target. "Well, well, look at this guy," the thug sneered, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "What are you looking at, old man?" Mr. Clark glanced at him briefly, keeping his expression calm. "I'm just appreciating the guard's dedication," he said softly, hoping to defuse the tension. But his composed response only seemed to fuel the thug's aggression. "Dedication?" the man laughed mockingly. "You mean standing around like a statue all day? Yeah, real impressive." He took a step closer to Mr. Clark, his voice rising. "What about you, huh? You think you're some wise old man? Let me guess, one of those know-it-all teachers who think they're better than everyone." The crowd began to grow uneasy, their whispers turning into murmurs of concern. Parents held their children a little closer, and some people took out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Mr. Clark remained calm. He had spent years handling difficult students and knew the power of staying composed. "There's no need for this," he said gently, his tone steady. "We're all here to enjoy the day. Let's keep it peaceful." But the thug wasn't interested in peace. His smirk widened as he stepped even closer, towering over Mr. Clark. "Oh, I see," he sneered. "You're one of those types, always telling people what to do. You think you're better than me, don't you?" Mr. Clark shook his head, his voice still calm. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just believe we should treat each other with respect." The thug's mocking laughter cut through the tension. "Respect? Don't make me laugh, old man. You think you're some kind of hero?" He shoved Mr. Clark lightly, enough to make the crowd gasp. Mr. Clark stumbled slightly but managed to keep his footing. His hands trembled slightly as he steadied himself, not from fear, but from the vulnerability that came with age. Despite this, he straightened his back and looked the thug in the eye. "I'm no hero," he said firmly. "But that doesn't mean I'll let you act like this." The thug's face darkened, and his tone became more threatening. "What are you going to do about it, huh? Teach me a lesson? You're just an old man." The crowd watched in silence, tension building with every word. Mr. Clark, though calm and dignified, was clearly vulnerable. His patience and quiet strength made him a stark contrast to the thug's loud, aggressive behavior. But the thug wasn't done. His taunts grew louder, and his movements became more erratic. The crowd murmured nervously, some wondering if they should intervene, others hoping the situation wouldn't escalate further. Mr. Clark, despite the danger, stood his ground. He had spent his life teaching respect and kindness, and he wasn't about to let those values be trampled. Still, the tension in the air was undeniable. The thug's aggression was building, and the vulnerable teacher was in a dangerous position. The royal guard, silent and still, watched from his post. His training told him to remain motionless, but his grip on his rifle tightened. He was prepared to act if the situation demanded it, and it seemed that moment was quickly approaching. The scene was set, and everyone in the crowd could feel it. Something was about to happen. The thug's mocking laughter echoed through the crowd as he took another step toward Mr. Clark. His tone was sharp and dripping with disdain. "What are you going to do about it, old man?" "Huh?" He gave Mr. Clark a slight shove, causing him to stumble back. The crowd gasped in shock. Parents shielded their children, pulling them closer, while others whispered nervously, unsure of what to do. A few brave onlookers raised their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Mr. Clark steadied himself, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Despite the shove, he remained calm, his voice steady. "There's no need for this," he said gently. "We're all here to enjoy the day. Let's not ruin it." But the thug wasn't interested in reason or kindness. His smirk widened as he circled the elderly teacher, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "Enjoy the day," he sneered. "The only thing I'm enjoying is watching you squirm." With a swift movement, he shoved Mr. Clark again, harder this time. The teacher stumbled but caught himself, refusing to fall. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. A woman whispered urgently to her partner, "Someone needs to step in." Another man muttered, "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" Still, no one moved. The thug's imposing presence and erratic behavior had everyone frozen in place. The royal guard, standing tall and disciplined at his post, noticed everything. His gaze remained fixed ahead, his face expressionless as protocol demanded, but his grip on his rifle tightened subtly. He could hear the thug's taunts, see the growing fear in the crowd, and sense the vulnerability of the man being targeted. "Come on, old man," the thug continued, his voice rising. "You talk a big game about respect, but you can't even stand up for yourself." He jabbed a finger into Mr. Clark's chest, pushing him back another step. "Face it, you're nothing but a weak, washed-up has-been." The teacher looked at him, his eyes filled with a quiet strength that didn't match his frail appearance. "It doesn't take strength to hurt people," Mr. Clark said, his voice firm. "Real strength is about treating others with respect, even when they don't deserve it." The thug laughed loudly, turning to the crowd as if performing for them. "Did you hear that? The old man thinks he's some kind of philosopher." He shoved Mr. Clark again, this time with enough force that the teacher nearly lost his balance. The crowd gasped audibly, their anxiety reaching a boiling point. Some began inching closer, unsure if they should intervene, while others looked to the royal guard for action. The guard, still motionless, was watching everything with laser focus. His training told him to stay still, to remain disciplined, but his instincts were screaming for him to act. The thug, emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences, grew bolder. "What's the matter?" he taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just scared to fight back?" Mr. Clark stood firm, his hands trembling slightly but his voice unwavering. "I'm not scared of you," he said quietly. The thug's face twisted with frustration. "Not scared? We'll see about that." He raised his voice even louder, addressing the crowd. "Look at this guy. He's just standing there, acting like he's better than me. What a joke." The tension in the plaza was unbearable. Phones captured every second, and whispers turned to murmurs of concern. "Why isn't anyone stopping this?" someone asked. "What about the guard?" The thug turned his attention back to Mr. Clark, his smirk replaced by a darker, more menacing expression. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Well, let's see how smart you are when I knock that smug look off your face." He raised his fist, aiming at the teacher, and the crowd collectively gasped. Parents shielded their children's eyes, and several voices shouted, "No." But before the thug's punch could land, something happened. In a blur of motion, the royal guard moved. As the thug's fist swung through the air, aiming for Mr. Clark, time seemed to slow. The crowd froze, their gasps echoing in the tense silence. Parents shielded their children's eyes, some whispered frantic prayers, while others stood paralyzed, phones clutched tightly, recording every second. But before the punch could land, something unexpected happened. In a blur of motion, the royal guard broke his stance. His red uniform, pristine and bold against the gray pavement, moved with precision and purpose. The once statuesque figure was now a force of action. The guard stepped forward, intercepting the thug's fist mid-air with an unyielding grip. His gloved hand closed around the man's wrist like a steel vice. The force of his action left the thug stumbling slightly, his smirk fading into wide-eyed disbelief. The crowd collectively gasped, their shock palpable. They had come expecting to see a silent, immovable royal guard, not a figure of authority stepping into action. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the guard's calm yet commanding presence as he held the thug's wrist firmly, his grip unwavering. The thug struggled against the guard's hold, his bravado now replaced with frustration. "What the? Let me go," he shouted, his voice trembling with both shock and anger. The guard, however, didn't flinch. His posture remained upright, his expression composed, and his authority unquestionable. With a deliberate push, he forced the thug back, creating a safe distance between him and Mr. Clark. The thug stumbled, nearly losing his balance, as the guard held his ground like an unmovable pillar. "That's enough," the guard said, his voice low and steady but cutting through the tense silence like a blade. The tone of his words left no room for argument. It wasn't a suggestion or a plea, it was a command. The thug, regaining his footing, glared at the guard, his face twisting with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You can't touch me," he spat. "You're just supposed to stand there like a statue." The guard's expression didn't change. His calm eyes locked onto the thug with a piercing intensity. Without raising his voice, he replied, "My duty is to protect. That includes protecting him," he gestured toward Mr. Clark, "from people like you." The thug's confidence faltered further as murmurs spread through the crowd. "Did you see that?" someone whispered in awe. "He stopped him like it was nothing." Meanwhile, Mr. Clark stood a few steps behind the guard, his face a mixture of shock and gratitude. He adjusted his glasses with trembling hands and whispered, "Thank you." The guard didn't turn or respond. His focus remained on the thug, whose earlier aggression had completely drained. The thug glanced nervously around at the disapproving stares of the crowd. He was no longer in control, no longer the center of attention in the way he wanted to be. The crowd, which had been silent moments before, began to stir. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then growing louder. People cheered for the guard's composure and courage, their admiration filling the air. But the guard wasn't swayed by the noise. He remained poised, his grip still firm on his rifle. His gaze didn't waver, and his disciplined stance sent an unmistakable message: this confrontation was over. The thug, now completely deflated, muttered under his breath and took a step back, but not before the guard made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any further aggression. The silence of the guard's stare was more powerful than any words could have been. With the tension broken and the thug subdued, the royal guard turned slightly to Mr. Clark, giving him the briefest of nods, a silent gesture of assurance. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to his post, his stance once again firm and immovable, a symbol of duty and discipline. But for everyone who had witnessed what had just unfolded, the royal guard was no longer just a ceremonial figure. He was a protector, a true embodiment of strength and honor. As the thug stumbled backward, defeated and humiliated, the crowd erupted into applause. Their cheers echoed across the plaza, a wave of admiration for the royal guard who had stepped in with such calm authority. But the guard remained composed, his attention now shifting to the man he had protected. Mr. Henry Clark, shaken but unbroken, stood a few feet away, adjusting his glasses with trembling hands. Though his body had felt the weight of the confrontation, his spirit remained strong. The applause from the crowd wasn't for him, but he felt an immense gratitude for the one who had stepped forward to defend him. The guard, breaking protocol yet again, took another step forward. Slowly, with deliberate purpose, he extended his gloved hand to Mr. Clark. The gesture was simple yet profound, and it spoke louder than any words ever could. Mr. Clark hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the humanity of the guard's action. Then, his hand reached out, grasping the guard's firmly. The teacher's hand was weathered with age, a testament to decades spent molding young minds. The guard's grip, strong yet gentle, provided reassurance, a silent message that Mr. Clark was safe. The crowd, watching this unexpected display of respect, grew quiet once more. The moment was heavy with emotion, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. Looking up at the guard, Mr. Clark's voice trembled, not with fear but with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his words carrying the weight of his appreciation. "You didn't have to do that, but you did. You've shown all of us what royal honor looks like." The guard didn't speak. His face, as disciplined as ever, revealed no hint of emotion. But in his eyes, there was a flicker of something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement of the teacher's words. He gave Mr. Clark a respectful nod, a silent response that said more than words ever could. The teacher let go of the guard's hand, steadying himself with a deep breath. His shoulders, which had carried the burden of the confrontation, relaxed. Turning slightly, he glanced at the crowd and saw their admiring faces, their phones raised high to capture the moment. The applause began again, louder this time. Some people clapped in rhythm, while others cheered openly. A woman near the front of the crowd whispered to her child, "This is what real strength looks like." The little boy nodded, wide-eyed, as he stared at the guard, his admiration clear. The guard, ever disciplined, didn't linger. After one last glance to ensure Mr. Clark was steady, he turned sharply on his heel and returned to his post. His tall frame stood firm, rifle in hand, gaze fixed ahead. To the untrained eye, it seemed as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The guard was back to his still, silent vigil, a figure of discipline and tradition. But to those who had witnessed the moment, the guard was now something more. Mr. Clark remained for a moment longer, watching the guard with a newfound respect. He adjusted his coat and turned to his granddaughter, who had come rushing through the crowd to check on him. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. "I'm fine," he replied with a small smile, glancing back at the guard one last time. "I'm better than fine. Today, I was reminded that honor still exists." The crowd slowly began to disperse, their voices filled with awe and admiration. Phones were lowered, whispers of what they had witnessed spreading through the plaza like wildfire. The guard, now standing tall and motionless once more, had returned to his role, but his actions would be remembered. He had broken protocol not out of impulse, but out of a deep understanding of his duty, not just to tradition, but to humanity. His gesture of respect had turned an ordinary moment into something extraordinary. As Mr. Clark and his granddaughter left the plaza, the teacher glanced over his shoulder one last time. The guard remained in his post, a silent protector, as Buckingham Palace stood proudly behind him, a symbol of enduring honor and strength. The thug, his earlier bravado now completely shattered, stood with his head hung low as palace security arrived. Two officers stepped forward, quickly assessing the situation. Without hesitation, they took hold of the thug's arms, their firm grip ensuring he couldn't lash out again. "Let's go," one of them said, his voice curt and authoritative. The crowd watched in silence as the humiliated thug was escorted away, his loud taunts and swagger replaced by shame and defeat. His eyes darted around nervously, meeting only disapproving stares from the onlookers. Phones were raised high, recording every step of his walk of shame. The echoes of his earlier arrogance seemed like a distant memory now. As the thug disappeared from view, the tension in the plaza lifted. The silence that had held everyone in its grip broke into something else: applause. It started with a few tentative claps, then spread rapidly. Soon, the entire crowd erupted into cheers, their admiration for the royal guard filling the air. People leaned into one another, exchanging words of awe. "Did you see how calm he was?" one man whispered. "He didn't even flinch," another replied. Parents knelt down to explain to their children what had just happened, emphasizing the importance of respect and strength. Amidst the applause, Mr. Clark stood quietly, his granddaughter now at his side. His eyes stayed on the guard, a man who had not only defended him but done so with grace and discipline. "That young man didn't just protect me," he murmured to his granddaughter. "He reminded all of us what honor looks like." The royal guard, now back at his post, stood motionless once more. His rifle was steady, his gaze fixed forward, and his posture as composed as ever. To the untrained eye, it might seem as though nothing had happened, but for everyone who had witnessed the events, the guard's actions would not be forgotten. The cheers began to die down, replaced by quiet murmurs of admiration. "I'll never forget this," someone said, their phone still aimed at the guard. "He didn't just stand there, he did what was right." The camera phones continued to capture the moment, documenting an extraordinary act of courage and composure for the world to see. Tourists walked away, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling as they recounted the story. As the plaza settled, the royal guard remained still, the very picture of discipline. But in that stillness was a deeper message, one that transcended tradition. In that moment, the royal guard proved that real strength isn't about standing still, it's about knowing when to act to protect what matters. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over Buckingham Palace. Life in the plaza returned to normal, but for those who had been there, the memory of the guard's actions would linger. To many, he was more than just a ceremonial figure that day, he was a symbol of honor, courage, and the quiet power of doing what's right.